Good day, everybody. Welcome back to the Coptimizer podcast. I've got another exciting show scheduled for you today. We have Matt Dolan from the Dolan Consulting Group with us today. And this one I've been looking forward to for a couple weeks now since we had our first discussion. But I know for those of you in the law enforcement world, you've probably heard of the Dolan Consulting Group. They put on training across the country, and most recently during COVID, they switched to an online platform, and they were early adopters and pivoters into that realm, and they've done it very well. But I've been familiar with them for a while. They used to have a training center not far from where I'm located here in Lafayette, down in the Indianapolis area. And so, yeah, there's a ton that I want to bring up and chat about it once we get going here, Matt. But the Weathering the Storm and Police Staffing document that you guys put out a few weeks ago, I think is spot on. And I wanted to take some time to talk about that today. But before we get to that, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks very much, Chief. I'm really happy to be here. Appreciate it.
So you are an attorney and you are the son of a police chief.
Yeah, I'm the son, the grandson, the great-grandson, the godson, the nephew of police officers. So my father, who works with us at Dolan Consulting Group, this is myself, my brother Keenan, my father Harry, who are a family business. But he is from an NYPD family. So my grandfather, four of his brothers, and my great-grandfather, they were all New York City police officers. And so my father grew up in that environment. College basketball brought him to the state of North Carolina. And then he became a Raleigh cop back in the very early 80s. He was there for several years as a beat officer. And then he put in for a chief's job in a very small agency in the mountains of North Carolina. And he got it. So he never made sergeant, but went from beat cop in Raleigh to police chief. And then moved us to Lumberton, North Carolina, a few years later when he got that police chief's job. Then Grand Rapids, Michigan. And then he ended his career as the police chief of the department he couldn't make sergeant on. So he left in the early 80s. So I don't know if there's a lesson there about karma or about, being nice to people, and you never know. But he came back at the end of his career and actually was able to end it where it began in municipal policing. As the chief of police in Raleigh, North Carolina, ended his career back in 2012. And as you referenced a minute ago, we were both teaching. And what really brought me into this was that I was an attorney. I thought about going into law enforcement as a young man. And I've told people this all the time, but it's the God's honest truth. It was out of an abundance of respect for the profession that I decided not to go into it. I graduated from law school in 2009. I went to DePaul undergrad, went to Loyola University, Chicago, School of Law. And my plan initially was to be a prosecutor. I thought you book them, I cook them would be a pretty respectable, pivot for the cop family I come from in light of that. But I knew I wanted to be in a climate controlled environment. And I knew I didn't want to roll around in the mud and the blood and the beer. And it's a full contact sport, as you know.
Yes,
and I also had heard about professional backer-uppers growing up from multiple generations of law enforcement, and paycheck cops and
backup Bob.
Yep, and
sorry, just no disrespect to all the Bobs out there.
All the Bobs,
There's a lot of good Bobs out there too.
Yeah, but you hear as a kid, as a teenager, from uncles and my grandfather when he was still with us. Just the problem that is like any profession, the problem of people, their heart isn't in it. They're just kind of here. They're angling for what my grandfather would call a white shirt job, trying to test their way into one of those positions. And I didn't want to be that person. I didn't want to be somebody that really wasn't that interested in being a cop, but maybe went in with my college degree or in 2009, going in with my JD. I had good friends of mine who said, Matt, you should go into policing. And you'll remember, Chief, that back in 2009, 2010, there were a lot of people with law degrees, with MBAs that were going into policing. Now, some of those folks, it was actually something they had thought about before, and things have a funny way of working out, and it was great for them and for the agency. But there's some other folks you hear about anecdotally that they were just waiting for the next, MBA opportunity or the next JD opportunity to come up. And so I had to explain to a couple of really good friends of mine who were great guys. look, I can't do that to a police department. I wouldn't do that to the Chicago PD. I wouldn't do that to any of the suburban agencies because I don't want to do it. And they were saying, no, Matt, just, get that on your resume. Just keep your head down. I said, no, my grandfather would be rolling in his grave if I did that. And so I do tell people this, but it is genuine, that I really had too much respect for the profession to do it poorly. And that was something that I thought a lot about. And so instead, I was a solo practitioner for a couple of years. I know I mentioned a minute ago, I thought about being a prosecutor. Somewhere along the way in law school, I got really interested in labor and employment law. And maybe as someone that's a retired chief, you can relate to this. I thought that might be something that would be a disappointment to my father, who was the Grand Rapids police chief at that time. And I said, Pop, I'm thinking instead of criminal law, I think I'm going to go into labor and employment law. I really find it fascinating, these cases about labor and employment. And he said, great. He said, I've been getting a crash course in labor and employment law as the GRPD chief for the last few years. And really, when you become a police chief, it's the world of personnel management. And we need people in professions like policing that understand that if you can't get the personnel part right, everything else is just wasting time. So he really, got it, why that was something that matters in a profession like law enforcement. And so for a couple of years in the private sector, never sued a police department, never sued anyone in law enforcement. I had a sense that maybe, given the family background, that might not be a good idea. And I didn't want to be on the wrong side of that. So didn't touch that with the 10-foot pole. But when it came to private sector, I was a solo practitioner out of necessity, really, from 2009 onward for a couple of years there. And then the real game changer for me and really just the blessing that it's been to have this job, this niche. I'm probably the happiest lawyer that I know. And I think about those big law firm jobs that you wanted, back when you're in your mid-20s and you're thinking about the money. And I'm just a very, very happy lawyer, very fortunate to hopefully contribute in some way to this profession and get to do it as an attorney, get to do it as an inside cat with nice soft hands that's in a climate controlled environment. I get the best of both worlds by doing that. And I'm pretty open about it. But that really came with Public Agency Training Council out of Indianapolis, Indiana, that you referenced at that time. My father was doing some training. My father trained when he could throughout the 90s into the 2000s, community policing, leadership, then really was interested in de-escalation long before it was a common talking point for everybody in the country as it is now. So pre-Ferguson, by a number of years, he was getting into verbal de-escalation and really understood it as just sort of a repackaging of a skill set that good police officers have developed over generations. So he had that background. And so the now former owner of PATC gave me a great opportunity. And that opportunity was to help out with labor and employment, personnel, hiring, firing, everything in between. At the time, if I recall correctly, they had some attorneys that were really great when it came to search and seizure and when it came to use of force policies. And all those things are so important. But as I think we would agree on, Chief, when you talk about weathering the storm, when you talk about who's going to be filling the ranks, your greatest asset and your greatest liability, it's the men and women that are in those squad cars, that are responding to a call for service, that are initiating a stop. That's your liability. That's your asset. So they needed that. I did that for about 4 years. And then 6 years ago now, I'm at a decade of doing this full time as a trainer and consultant. The chief and I, my old man, and Keenan Dolan, and we even drafted my mother, who didn't know that she'd be the office manager. But that happens sometimes in family businesses, which I'm sure a lot of people can relate to. So I didn't mean to exclude her. My mom, Paula, is also our office manager. And some folks that do training with us, they'll recognize
and the main disciplinarian, I'm sure.
Yeah. Oh, it gets really tricky with the organizational chart. I'm not really sure, especially around the holidays. I don't know who's, I know on paper I'm the director, but when your mother is the office manager, I feel like she outranks you whenever she wants to. So it's been an interesting family business experience. But on a personal note, I feel really, really lucky that we have the kind of family that we do, because I think a lot of folks can attest to this. A lot of folks grew up in family businesses or they know family businesses. And if you don't have a really great foundation, it's a pretty tough thing to get through. And we've been really fortunate over the last 6 years to be able to kind of find our own, rules of, my wife and my sister-in-law and my brother. They don't want to hear about it at Thanksgiving. So how do you try to, figure out a way to separate work and family life? But I guess that's another podcast. But anyway, that's been the last 10 years for me, has been really doing the same thing in terms of training. And really, I'm a student of law enforcement, is maybe a way that I could sort of summarize my experience over 10 years. Yes, the student part of it makes sense when I talk about traveling around the country, and I obviously enjoy talking, and I talk for a living in many ways. But I really have done a lot of listening, and I've filled up so many notepads with notes. And then after a while, for me, you learn a little trick, which is when you hear the same problems in Louisiana, New Jersey, Illinois, Alaska, Arizona, you start to connect those dots and say, this isn't just your agency problem. This is a profession-wide challenge. And then you start to speak with some sense of authority about it. And people go, wow, it's like you're at my police department. Wow, it's like you're at our sheriff's office.
It's like somebody should do something about that.
Well, yeah. And the truth of it is, no, you don't have to be a genius you just fly enough, and you talk to enough people, and you let them vent a bit about the personnel challenges, about the leadership failures that happen, the short-term thinking, kicking the can down the road, issues. A lot of the training that I've focused on for 10 years, and it's sort of odd when I tell people at a barbecue or something about what I do. I mean, most of my focus, honestly, Chief, is dealing with bad officers. How do we deal with the toxic outliers? I hope that I have a bit of a niche here, because when I tell people about my family tradition, when I tell them in advance that I'm going to hit them up for handouts in terms of temporary tattoos for my kids, stickers and coloring books, I'm pro law enforcement. It's because I'm a pro law enforcement civilian attorney that I think it's so important that we focus on that 2 or 3 out of 100 that brings so much nightmare problems to an agency. So it's sort of an interesting thing that, in one way, it's, well, I'm here to talk about all the problems, confronting the toxic officer, and making discipline stick, and all this stuff. And as you can imagine, I've walked into a lot of rooms, and people aren't happy to see me, because all they know is that there's a training called making discipline stick, which sounds an awful lot like sticking it to cops or confronting the toxic officer, and they're just not in the mood to hear the civilian attorney tell them that they all suck. And then you try to tell them right out of the gate, that's not what this is. This is, as a profession, you're as noble as they come, but part of that nobility is having the humility to say, we're not doing everything right. There's some things that we're missing, and that's just being a human being. That's being an organization made up of human beings. And in my humble opinion, the agencies that I think are the most squared away are the ones that have a healthy dose of, I know we're missing some things, I know we can do things better. Just a little bit of that self-criticism, not beating themselves up, not summer of 2020 doing a dance for protesters and saying we've always sucked, not doing that, but to have a healthy dose of, we're not perfect. We've got 200 people that work here. We've got 10 people that work here. We're not perfect. There's things we're missing. Those are the agencies that I think are the ones that I would want to call in an emergency, the ones that have that dose of self-criticism. And I get to work with a lot of those agencies that I think are threading the needle of saying, this is a noble profession, this is an honorable agency, but we're not perfect, and we want to continually work to get better. So that's what makes for a very happy lawyer, is to have a job like that. Plus, cops are a lot more interesting to be talking to than lawyers. I don't talk to lawyers all that often. And actually, I have to be honest, Chief, sometimes it gets to be where I'm the odd person out, because I'm a little bit too frank, and I want to just like cut the bull. Well, what you mean is that, okay, wait, there's 10 attorneys here. We don't like to say what we mean. That's not very advisable. So I have a lot more fun talking to cops than I do lawyers as a general.
If you say it, you're on the record. Well,
yeah.
So, dealing with it, making discipline stick. I love that expression, but I've coined a little phrase myself, and that, over the especially in the last decade or so. I mean, it's probably always been this way, but in general, in one of the discussions we'll get in today in terms of hiring and the dangers of what might happen when you change standards or lower standards. In policing, I've always said that we're really good at breaking people. We don't hire bad cops. We make them. and we do that by overtasking, underfunding, not training, not preparing properly, and really, quite frankly, setting them up to fail by putting them out there into an environment where we ask them to do a lot, and then when they make a mistake or when they fail, uh, oftentimes we blame the individual and we don't look at the system in which we've asked these individuals to work. And yeah, I mean, it's not to say that there, a few do slip through the cracks every now and then, and we certainly have a huge responsibility to make sure that we weed them out, but because they can cause a lot of sleepless nights, especially for administrators. But
well, and Chief, I think you nailed it, Chief, when you talk about the conversation: do we hire them, or do we make them? And I think, as you mentioned in the way you described it, I think pretty much everyone I know that's been doing the job as long as you have, they believe it's some combination. You may get disagreement. Is it 70-30? Is it 80-20? But we hire some people in a hurry. We hire folks quick and dirty when there's a hiring frenzy. We need warm bodies. So that's part of the hiring them problem. And then also you have people that, as you said, we make them. And one of the phrases I tend to use is, can we deal with this when it's minor league stupid instead of major league dangerous? And some of the most damaging things you can do. You think jamming people up. If somebody could write a book, maybe you'll do it, Chief, or maybe somebody that through podcasting and through your connections. I would love to read a book on getting jammed up, just the origins of that and what getting jammed up is, because it seems to me that it's fundamentally misunderstood, especially at the sergeant's position. Because if you think as a sergeant that you're not jamming people up by not correcting, by not hurting feelings, by not putting pen to paper on some people, no, what you're doing is damaging them in a way that far exceeds anything you could do in a short term, hurting someone's feelings, or even taking away a day's worth of beer and pizza money for a 23-year-old officer whose heart's in the right place, but they made a mistake that they need to be made aware of in a serious way. And it's always perilous to make this comparison, but I've got a 7-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 2-week-old. And it has been interesting, whether you're looking at it from a parent's perspective, from a coach's perspective, you're not helping anybody by not correcting early and often. Now, you need to do it the right way. You need to do it in a way where you're not just catching them make mistakes. But I just find it to be such a sadly predictable drumbeat when you've got first line folks that aren't stepping in and correcting on what can begin as minor things, can begin as demeanor issues, can begin as sloppy report writing. And then, unfortunately, I get brought in when we've got folks that have been here for 12 years, and then you hear about, well, it's just a few bad apples. Well, how long has this apple been stinking the place up? Because I'm hearing stories about, well, I should know, this guy's a grade A asshole, and I should know because I was his FTO. Now, then I have to find a way of asking, well, what did the higher ups do with your DORs? Because if he's an asshole, then I'm sure you indicated that on the DORs. Who can remember? Well, what that means is you didn't do anything. You didn't do your job. And now you want to moan and groan about how this person's been here, but you failed at your moment when you could step in and do something. So I'm with you. I think that, unfortunately, there's a lot of focus on that back end, but not asking enough questions about the front end. And maybe to pivot a bit to something that's on my mind, the weathering the storm and police staffing with the big question mark at the end of it. The way that we've always done things is a phrase that gives me a lot of heartburn, because as a fan of history of the profession of law enforcement, among other things, we do things the way that we've always done them until there is a catastrophe, and then we reassess. And I think one of those areas is the possibility, without getting into the Kevin Gilmartin, Brian and Navity area too much. I hear a lot of stories over the years, Chief, about people that were really solid officers, really solid law enforcement professionals for 7-8 years, and then they were done. They weren't in a place anymore where they wanted to do the job, but they were in a world where, well, you've got to get to your 20, or you got to get to your 25, you got to get to your 30. And so I think when you look at the military approach to recruiting and retention, what allowed us to rebuild the military after Vietnam in an all-volunteer environment, we couldn't have done that if we relied on people to be in the military for 20 or 30 years. And so I think those are the kinds of things that hopefully we can start to change now, so that we don't keep having the same conversations about toxic officers and making discipline stick and all those problems. And by the way, on the making discipline stick, one of the things that often makes discipline not stick, we can blame arbitrators and we can blame judges, but we as an agency have to ask, wait a minute, why do we hire this person? And how is it they've worked here for 11 years and they've got meets expectations, performance evaluations, and no one's ever taken them on? That's confusing to an arbitrator when you want to fire somebody who has a, on paper, great record like that.
Yeah, and there's a lot to, that we could discuss on that, but what it really boils down to, and a lot of different ways to say it, but I think Jocko Willink says it the best in that you get what you tolerate, right? And that's so that that really is the expectation for your organization. If you tolerate poor performance, you're gonna get a percentage of it, and you're generally, I think. And you mentioned this earlier, but you get to travel around the country, and that's one of the things that even as a chief or as a supervisor, back in in my SWAT days or whatever, when you're traveling around, you're going to different schools. We've always had this, I think, awareness in law enforcement that we suffer from the same illnesses everywhere you go. But you also see a reluctance really to do much about it. It's kind of, we have a tendency to pass problems on, kick the can down the road, like you said, and not really face them head on. And another trainer, Stu Middleton, out from Operational Tactics out east, he had a saying: "It's not a problem till it's a problem, and then it's a problem." In any case, in terms of your frontline supervisors, if they don't address issues at the earliest possible time, then those problems are just going to kind of breed, small problems become big problems. And like you said, minor league problems, where discipline, if done right and done at the appropriate time, is going to prevent the major league problems from happening. So discipline is often viewed by the frontline officer as something that's punitive, or it's received as being punitive. Like, you don't like me, and that's why you're doing this, and you're just trying to punish me for doing something wrong. Where the reality is, no, what we're trying to do is change behavior. We've identified something that's problematic, that's not good for you individually. It's not good. It doesn't reflect good performance. And it's not going to be good for the agency. So if we can course correct now, then we can change the trajectory not only of you and your career path, and potentially save you from doing something that might end your career, or certainly derail it for a significant period of time, to being able to thrive.
And you nailed it, Chief, because it's about the difficult conversations. And maybe if we put it in what might be an odd context, and I don't know if we want to use this, because again, this is getting into sort of a perilous comparison. But my wife and I, this is our 4th time with the baby. There's a lot of teamwork going on. There's a lot of shift work. In having a 2-week-old with 3 older kids and getting them to school this morning, and all that. When you think about it, in a marriage, and that's, I know, a priority for me personally. No one's getting written up in my marriage, but there's conversations we have. And honestly, this has never occurred to me until just something that you said in there made me think of this. We have conversations that, and we're not yellers, we're not having fights, but it's, hey Matt, listen, when you come home and blank blank blank, minor stuff, that really bothers me. Now, she could wait until next summer, or she could wait 2 years and let that build up. She could tell her friends about it and not tell me, or she could tell me about it and I can course correct and we can move forward, and I can do the same thing for her. Now, I'm walking a bit of a tightrope whenever I'm comparing something like marriage to leadership and supervision in law enforcement, but it occurs to me that, it would be unhealthy, I think, for me to, instead of addressing with my wife, who I love so much, instead of talking to her about it, just talking to my buddies about it, and then just getting more and more pissed off. Well, similarly, in police departments, sometimes the last person, and I'm sure you've seen this in your career, the last person to be told, Dolan, no one wants to work with you. And the reason no one wants to work with you is because you don't do verbal judo, you do jackass jujitsu. You show up and you talk people into fights, and nobody wants to work with you. You're the problem. The issue that's so sad is, so often, we'll never know because it's a counterfactual, This is an individual that's worked in this department for 12 years. And no one has ever sat down and said, don't you see what you're doing? Don't you see what the problem is? No one has taken that on. But back to my point a moment ago, we tell everybody else about it. I've had supervisors that say we don't have time to document. And I've got to call BS on that 99 times out of 100. There are some agencies where you've got sergeants right now that are supervising 22, 24 people. So I want to leave the door cracked open, exceptions. But as a general matter,
span of control is a problem.
It is a problem. But as a general rule, I've got sergeants that don't have that issue, and they make time to talk trash. They make time to spread. Everyone knows Dolan's nickname is Hammerhead. He's got a big head, and every time he shows up, he does a lot of damage, and everybody knows it, right? And it's a running joke. So if he's got a nickname, if people on different shifts know about his greatest hits, and I mean that in the worst way, but he's never been sat down and counseled in a serious way. Well, doesn't the agency own some of that? Of course they do. They own a lot of that.
So you just reminded me. I did this exercise with my staff once, and try to as a way to maybe illustrate the point. All of our sergeants, lieutenants, captains, deputy chief, myself, we broke down into small groups. And what I told them, and it was just a thought exercise. I was like, okay, and this was post 2008, 2009 time frame. So I think we were around 2013 or so. As like the exercise is there is a budget shortfall, and the city is short. We're gonna have to cut officers. So if we have 20 officers on each shift, we work 12-hour shifts. Each shift is going to have to cut 3 people. So I want you to break down into your groups and tell me which 3 people are, you're going to submit names to be laid off. And so the groups break down, and after just a couple minutes, they say, yep, okay, we've got our 3. And I was like, okay, well, I don't want to hear names. What I do want to hear is, what was your methodology? What's your thought process? Which officers are you going to cut? And across the board, what would be your first guess as to who we're going to let go first? What do you think is going to be the number one criteria in 2013 for who should be laid off and who stays?
No, will it be the person that's causing problems when they show up to the scene? I don't know. Is that...
Nope. No, it was seniority based. So seniority is whoever's been here the longest, that's who we're going to keep, right? They've been here the longest, they deserve to be here. They've earned that spot. And that's kind of what I anticipated, but also a little bit of what you suggested as well. Who are the troublemakers? And that's why I said I don't want to hear any names. Just what I want to hear is your methodology. So then I followed it up with the second question. I said, okay, now more bad news. The cuts are bigger than we thought. So now I have to cut. There's 3 supervisors on each shift. I have to cut 1 supervisor from each shift. So I'm going to tell you what my criteria is going to be. Is that my criteria for determining who's going to be here is I'm going to go and I'm going to look at performance evaluations. So I'm going to look to see who's performing, and then I'm going to look at shift data, and we're going to look at production on shifts. And really what I'm looking for is I'm looking to find which supervisors are leading shifts that are driving the most value. And of course, that goes over like a lead balloon in the room. And now I said, now go back, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to change your criteria for which officers you're going to which you're going to keep and who you're not going to keep, before I make the decision about which supervisors are going to stay or go. So then that really shifted the mindset to the people in the room. Now we're thinking, well, I've got to think about production, and seniority goes out the window, because my job is dependent on the work that my subordinates are engaged in. And it was a really interesting question. But in some of the things that popped up in that, where when I asked, some people got upset by the fact that well, how could you do that? How could you make a decision based on performance and not on seniority? That's just not fair. And I'm like, how many people here have worked in the private sector? If you worked in the private sector, if you're responsible for running a business and your business is losing money, where do you think the money comes from to keep the business afloat? The business goes under, everybody loses their job. Yeah. It's not just a couple people having to make hard decisions. The whole organization goes under. It's like, but in our world, in public safety, we have a secure tax base, generally speaking, for the most part, where we know what our budget's going to be every year, and performance sometimes isn't even a consideration for how we manage our organizations. And maybe it should be. Maybe we should be thinking about this value equation. But the other interesting thing is, like, I asked the question after we got done with that. I'm like, okay, now let's go back to the beginning. When I initially said you have to cut 3 people from your shifts. Now everybody in here went there, right? And I asked you not to say names, right? Absolutely. Everybody in your mind, like 3 names. I want you to think about that right now. Who are those 3? And everybody in the room starts chuckling and laughing, and they're kind of making the discussion about, and everybody's got different reasons why, right? Some of them are performance based, some of them are personality based. But but at the end of that, when everybody was chuckling, I asked a serious question. I said, okay, everybody in this room is in a position to do something about it. So what are you doing about those 3 people? And that's the response. It got dead quiet. Yeah. Smiles went away. And it's like, you can't, I certainly have my role and my responsibility as the chief, but I'm dependent on you as my frontline supervisors to do the work that needs to get done in order for the organization to thrive. If you're waiting for me to do it, it's not going to get done because I'm not there with you. And if you're waiting for me to do it, it means that we've let, like the way you say it, we've let those minor league problems become major league problems. And that is not good for the organization. And so I think at the root of that, it is a problem in public safety that, especially for smaller agencies, the small to mid-size agencies, one day you're partners with your best friend, the next day you're their supervisor. So you've grown up on the streets together, you've worked together. There's only a few NYPDs out there where you may get transferred to, and I know this just because of the way they did things when I was in the service as well. Sure. When you become a supervisor, you're not necessarily going to be supervising the people that you work with. So I think that puts us. It's kind of that, again, that fundamental attribution error, right? We blame people for the systems that we have them working in, rather than trying to really think about, well, how do we need to change the systems in order to create better employees and more importantly, better supervisors. And you can send people all the training that you want, but if, like you said, if you have a supervisor that is just not going to have the difficult discussions, is not going to, sometimes be the bull in the china shop, then yeah, it's not a matter of if you're going to have a problem. It's going to be, when is the problem going to be, is it going to surface, and how bad is it going to be? Are we going to be able to save somebody, or is it going to be, a career ending type of decision?
Well, Chief, when you say save, that's the key word. And in my training a lot, I talk about discipline. If we're doing it the right way, we're saving careers.
Yes.
Discipline is about saving careers. Tough conversations is about saving careers. And it's nauseating to think about how many cups of coffee, how many beers, how many meals over which you have veterans inside the department who have debated. And the debate is, was this officer savable? We'll never know. The sergeant was, for lack of a better word, weak in terms of being confrontational. And what's striking to me as a civilian, that as I joked about, I think about things that we ask our officers to do on a regular basis, and I go, yeah, I don't want to do that. Okay, so I know that we have men and women who are so courageous in the line of duty, and they're confrontational in the right way, in the best way. But you take some of those same folks and you ask them to use that set of skills in the personnel management realm, and it's just lacking. It's just a completely different thing. They don't control that scene the way that they would in the field. And when that happens, you have those cups of coffee, those beers, those meals, over which people are saying, well, if Sergeant X had been his sergeant instead of Sergeant Y, I wonder if he'd still work here. I wonder if he would have been decertified. I wonder if he would have ended up pleading down to a misdemeanor. And there's too many of those conversations, and we'll never know. But the crux of it is, yeah, some of our sergeants are willing to hurt people's feelings if they have to. They don't want to, but they're not too shy about losing their Mr. or Miss Congeniality crown. They know that their job is to be a supervisor, and that means sometimes initiating the unpleasant conversations, being the bull in the china shop, as you said. And it's really a sad thought. And I don't ever want to make martyrs out of the individuals that I use as examples of police misconduct. But I do know that in many of those cases, no one was confronting them with the information when they needed it. And I would even say that when we talk about saving careers, to broaden it out a bit, even a termination can save a bunch of other careers. If you've got somebody who's in field training and they step over the line in 1,000 different ways and they're terminated, that sends a message to the other 10 people that are in field training that we're not playing around, that we actually mean it. And, I have the easy part of this whole thing. Training, as foundational as it is, that's actually the easy part, it seems to me. The tough part is actually going out and doing the damn thing every day when you don't feel like it, when you're tired, when you're not in, this is not ideal circumstances to have this conversation, not ideal circumstances to go over the body-worn camera footage and deal with this stuff. But that's the hard work, the training, the policies, procedures, that's all foundational. But if we don't have follow through from first line supervisors, and not just for the chiefs out there, but also IA investigators. I had a chance to speak to the National IA Investigators Association on day one of their conference in Clearwater, Florida, a few months ago. And what really seemed to go over well was the idea that if we don't get first line supervisors to start viewing themselves as risk managers, to start viewing themselves as men and women that have a responsibility here, that if they don't start recognizing that we need sergeants who are being trained on IA, we need sergeants and corporals and lieutenants that recognize that I don't care if it says professional standards on your business card. You are engaged in internal affairs. Are we going to handle it, or is the internet going to handle it? Is social media going to handle it for us? Is a politician going to handle it, or are we going to handle it? And that's internal affairs, writ large. And there were a lot of heads nodding in that room, a lot of positive feedback to the idea that if we don't see that change, I'll see you all in Florida again in 5-10 years. We'll be talking about the same damn things, about you getting complaints when it gets bad enough. In a thorough way, you are investigating, sustaining them, and ending careers or derailing careers. And then we go right back to square one, and we do it again and again and again. And nobody knows that better than our chiefs, our sheriffs, and our IA professionals.
It opens the doors for so many conversations on prevention, on identifying the problematic behavior at the earliest possible times. And again, I think your company, I think, is at the forefront of providing that training. And I guess for our listeners, the one thing that makes it easy for me to kind of have these discussions is because I've been there and I've made all those mistakes, right? As a young supervisor, when you don't handle it the right way, you can see the problems that can be created down the road, and sometimes it's hard not to learn the lessons the hard way. But if we're going to make improvements, as individuals, at some point you have to acknowledge that my responsibility first is to my community. And in order to be there for my community, I have to be there first for my agency. And that means I've got to hold people accountable to a standard, and I've got to make sure that my expectations are clear, and it needs to be an organizational culture. And it's easier said than done, but the work is never done. And that's, and I think that's important. So without going, I wasn't even planning on having that conversation today, but just that's the way these things go sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah.
But along those lines, I asked Dr. Plua when I was having this question. She's one of the guests on the show. She's an exercise physiologist. She's got her PhD. She works in the digital health realm, and we were talking a lot about, are there things that we can do from a training perspective and an individual perspective, and optimizing the individual by building through things like fitness and nutrition and sleep hygiene and all these things. Can we, at some point through technology, predict when an employee might be on the brink of catastrophe, when they are not primed for good behavior, but actually physiologically on the brink of disaster, by meaning they're emotionally dysregulated for a variety of reasons, high stress, low recovery. And so ultimately the question we got into is, and it's just the easy example to use, but an officer like Derek Chauvin and what happened in the George Floyd case, because as a chief, I can't help but to work backwards from that moment and say, okay, well, here is bad performance on display, and it's recorded, and it's not only on our own cameras, but by the bystanders that were around there. What went wrong and when did it go wrong? So was this an officer that just had a bad moment and a bad day, locked up, and got stuck in, I call it the doom loop, right? Couldn't make a decision to change course where he was. And because he was a strong influencer, clearly, nobody else had the strength to be able to break him out of the doom loop by pulling him off, by raising the right question. The question becomes was that preventable? And, as Gordon Graham likes to say, right, if it's predictable, it's preventable. That's like you're saying, being risk managers. Was he an officer that could have been saved? Could we have predicted that? And could we have prevented it?
Well, if I could just say this about Minneapolis, since you brought it up, I've been utilizing Minneapolis cases in my training for the better part of the 10 years I've been doing this. And I have no personal beef with the Minneapolis Police Department. I haven't spent hardly any time in that state. I've been to the airport a lot. But that's one of those agencies, if you want to talk about IA failures, if you want to talk about selection issues, there's been case after case. I mean, I can and have done a full 2 hours just on IA failures in the Minneapolis PD before George Floyd. So I can just look at what's publicly available before May of 2020 and just show you case after case, arbitration after arbitration, where the failure of leadership, the internal affairs failure to deal with problems was rampant. Now, I can't speak to Chauvin personally, but when you've got IA operations that stink to high heaven, like they did in Minneapolis, interestingly enough, in the summer of 2020, you may recall it was all the arbitrators. We got to get rid of these arbitrators because they're ruining everything. And then a little bit more quietly, and I don't know, I'm not a PR guy, but if I wanted to have a news story that wasn't too big of a news story, I might make a statement between Christmas and New Year's. And that's what Minneapolis did. And they announced between Christmas and New Year's of 2020 that actually, we blamed the arbitrators. Turns out we might have some real problems in how we hold our people accountable and in how we conduct investigations. So we're actually going to have city attorneys working embedded in IA, in IAD from here on out. So Happy New Year. So when you look at the Minneapolis case, I see, at least from a high level, I see, failures that are demonstrable. And are not secrets. And you look back and you forget about Mohammed Noor. I mean, a young woman, the Australian yoga instructor who called 911, got shot in the head within a couple of moments of two officers showing up. And you look under the hood on Mohammed Noor, what his FTO said, what they wrote about why he shouldn't be there. Apparently that wasn't a rock bottom for that organization. So that's one of those where it's not about kicking an agency while they're down, but if we don't learn something from what happened in Minneapolis. God help us. We have to look at that and say, this didn't come out of nowhere. This is the same agency that gave us the Mohammed Noor hire. It's the same agency that gave us countless arbitration cases where the arbitrator comes out and says, no, he shouldn't be working. Yes, you're right. He violated the policy. He, beat a suspect who had his hands behind his back and was laying down on the ground. But that happened 3 years ago. And in the meantime, you've put him back on patrol and you've made him an FTO and you've told him he's doing a great job. So sorry, Chief, you don't get to fire him now. So those types of problems, I think, from an organizational standpoint, and that's one where this isn't my way of taking a shot at your rank and file Minneapolis cops. It's just saying I can see because I have an internet connection that we've got a couple of chiefs and a couple of city leaders in a row here that failed to hold people accountable internally, and that reflects everything else that we see happen there. So
yeah,
that's a conversation.
Yeah, and it's just another good example of sometimes you just got to take your medicine, right? Anyway, I brought that up because I wanted to use that kind of as a segue into what we really meant to talk about today is your document on weathering the storm and police staffing, and everything that we've talked about to this point is directly related to what you and Dr. Johnson wrote about in weathering the police staffing issue. And the 2000, it was probably 2015, not long after the Ferguson incident. When in speaking to our Police Citizens Academy classes, I made the statements back then that and I hate the fact that I was right here, but I told these groups that I was like, I'm like, is what people may not understand is that for all the problems that we hear about and see in policing, quite frankly, has never been better. From a technology perspective, from a personnel perspective, I say that, not meaning that there's not a lot of room for improvement, because there is, but there had been tremendous strides being made in law enforcement, in the professional development. But, when you're talking about 18,000 police departments across 50 different states with 50 different set of rules, there is no such thing as standardization. I do think that there are best practices and there are a lot of things that we can learn. But my concern was then that we're seeing a decline in the number of applications. Certainly in the number, in the diversity of the applications. And we're seeing an uptick in the number of people that are leaving the profession sooner. They're getting 20 years on and they're retiring. They're going on to do other things. And that you can forecast it. It didn't take a rocket scientist at the time to be able to say, look, if we beat down the profession, if we continually publicly criticize the profession, if within the profession itself, maybe most importantly, that we're not our own advocates for bringing in good people for the profession, then why should we expect good people of character and integrity and hardworking, good work ethic? Why would we expect them to come into the profession when those of us inside the profession are saying, don't do it, it's not worth it? I wasn't worried about 5 years. I was worried about 10 years. 2025 is where I said that's kind of my concern, because what's going to happen eventually, agencies are going to be losing people, and you could already see it happening in some of the major metropolitan areas, and not enough people to come fill the ranks. The calls for service are still coming in. The demand on police services are actually increasing, not decreasing. And that's evident if you just look at your CAD calls. If you look at your data inside your organizations, you can see that the demand and the expectations is on the increase, but our ability to handle that workflow is decreasing. That's not going to work out well. And so what's going to happen, right? Agencies are going to have to start finding new ways to hire people. And what was the first thing that happened is the cannibalization. The incentives to lure good police officers from one area into another. So, it kind of becomes the haves and the have-nots. And then quite frankly, you get to the point where you just have to start making decisions about, okay, I've got 500 openings and I have 250 applicants. And of those 250, if on average, my agency, we screened out on average about 92% of the applicants that came in got screened out for one reason or another, that the math just doesn't work out. And so now you're going to have to start making decisions. We're going to have to start cutting corners. So that's the downside. That's the downside is that you worry about the decisions that you're going to make organizationally that could have long-term negative consequences. I think one of the upsides to this is that and this is where you guys really nailed it in this document, is it as a leader, you have to really start thinking about, well, what does the future look like? And if we're not going to have the bodies, maybe we need to change the way that we operate. Maybe we need to change the way that we provide services. Maybe we need to think more creatively about what the future of policing is going to look like. So with that, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, the math equation, and it's one where, half the time as I've been talking more and more about this, and I incorporate it in my recruiting and hiring training. First, I'll just say I think there's a bit of a triage approach that every agency understandably should take. And first of all, if you are an agency that has community support, which I happen to think for a lot of cops is about as important as pay and benefits, because this is an intrinsic motivation profession like teaching and nursing and other professions where you think about your best teachers, your best nurses, your best cops. They're not doing this because this is the best way for them to make the most money, right? There has to be an internal motor there. So I think the community support agencies, the ones that are fully authorized or close to it, they are stealing cops from places where they feel unappreciated. And you know what? That's your obligation as a leader. God bless, right? I get all that. But that is a short-term solution. The long-term solution, which is, of course, much more challenging, if we're not going to just kick the can down the road, is to ask, where are all the quote-unquote baby cops? I've heard that a lot. We're not getting baby cops anymore. Everybody is just, cops in South Dakota are saying, yeah, we're stealing cops from California, and we're cops in North Carolina are stealing cops from New Jersey, and in metro areas, you're seeing that happen. But longer term, I hope that I don't sound doom and gloom. I really, at the risk of being too dramatic here, I think that we've got mechanical issues with the plane, our fuel is low, and we can either just wait and crash land, or we can start making some tough decisions and have a bumpy landing, which is a hell of a lot better than a crash landing. I've been a part of bumpy landings with all the travel I've done. I've done emergency landings in places that I didn't think I was going to go that night. And I'm still here to tell the tale. So I have an appreciation for the distinction between a bumpy landing, an emergency landing, and a crash landing. And I really, again, I don't mean to sound overly dramatic, but if we just go down this path, where we just say, well, we'll just have to get a pay bump, or we'll have to do this, and then we'll get the warm bodies back, we'll get quality candidates. The math just doesn't add up. And the document, Weathering the Storm on Police Staffing, with the big question mark on it, and we've debated and continue to debate what's the best title for what we're trying to tell people about. We played with the idea of the new normal in police staffing, but we thought folks probably were fatigued from hearing people talk about the new normal in the last 2 years. But if you look at the
I agree with that, by the way.
Yeah, so okay,
good call.
I'm glad to hear we made a good call on that. But it's tough to find something that encapsulates it. But having a PhD working with you like Dr. Johnson, it helps me because he can put together solid numbers on everything from birth rate, Gen Z, because we're not talking about 22-year-olds that are millennials anymore. They're Gen Z. This is the smallest generation that we've had. In my lifetime, your lifetime, there's just not as many people. And this is not my Catholic way of bringing up, hey, everyone has an obligation to go and have four kids or more. But it's just a math equation of we just have less people. You're seeing this, by the way, Chief, in a lot of colleges and universities that are struggling to figure out how do we sustain, because they just don't have as many 18-year-old graduates to put in those seats, among other things. So you start off just with the plain math on, they're just, the cops programs in the mid-90s, I'm sure you remember.
Yeah.
My father was a police chief, and under the Clinton administration, this money was going out there, hiring cops. Well, when you look at in 1970, 1971, we were manufacturing, if you will, a lot more kids that were then prime hiring age in the mid 90s. Today, you talk about the Biden administration, you talk about programs at the state level, the federal level to help with hiring. Now let's rewind 20, 25 years. We just didn't have an assembly line to begin with. Now you add to that the deaths of despair that we see among young people. This is not, well, every generation thinks the next generation is the end of all of it. No, we actually have objective indicators of physical and mental health issues. We have rates of obesity that are staggering among young people, among people of prime hiring on into public safety age. When you look at mental health issues, a shortcut to that is you look at the suicide rates, you look at the drug overdoses, and you look at the even cirrhosis of the liver. When you look at all those put together, that's not just, a stigma. That's not just, well, this next generation and these kids. Those are objective indicators that not only do we have a smaller pool of applicants for police, fire departments, chief. Fire departments are actively recruiting. That should tell you something. That this is a sign of the apocalypse. I mean, who would have ever thought that fire departments would have to talk people into that? And of course, we got to, tease our friends on the fire side of things. But, the joke always was, they show up, they put some water on it, the building's still burned down, but everybody claps for them and they tried their best and they all just go back and they have, some burgers and some steak. If you can't find people to do that job, what the hell are we talking about? This is something that really Dr. Johnson and I were talking and we're recognizing, not just law enforcement. And I think that it was just especially charged. It was like putting gasoline, what we saw in 2020, the scapegoating of law enforcement at a whole new fever pitch after what we saw post-Ferguson, just another round of demonization. I think that made things much worse. But even if we were to turn around tomorrow and say everybody loves police again, what's really frightening, Chief, is we'd still have a lot of math problems.
Yes.
When we talk about, you can't hire somebody that was struggling with meth addiction for 5, 6, 7 years. How do you hire that person? No matter how much you offer as starting pay, you only have so many people that have the ability to pass that background if we're going to have standards. I was in a part of the country in 2019, and by the way, in 2019, and you know this, and you referenced it, people were already talking about we are not getting enough quality candidates.
Yes.
Before COVID, before the death of George Floyd, we already had a problem. And I was in a part of the country that's been particularly hard hit by the opioid crisis. And a sergeant made a really good observation, and it kind of an eerie one. And he said, not only do we have more Narcan runs, not only are we going through Narcan, not only are we seeing all these overdoses that we're saving people, bringing people back to life. And not only that, he said, that's a problem. That's more calls for service. But also, these are young people in the county that should be our teachers, that should be our sheriff's deputies, that should be our dispatchers, and they can't because they're hooked and they're not really participating in life. Their calls for service are up, qualified applicants are down.
Number one cause of death between ages of 18 and 45 now is fentanyl overdose.
And it
surpassed heart disease.
Yeah, and it indicates that we have there is something wrong in that pool of applicants. Now, certainly, do we have people in their 20s? I almost said kids, but young people that are in their 20s that are great applicants? Absolutely, we know it, and you know it because you see them, you know them. But yes, what the math is telling us is, and we can have a conversation that we would probably be ill-suited to have, but whatever the societal, family things going on, we have got a lot of young men and women that are struggling just to function. And that's out of a smaller generation than we had. So where are these cops coming from? This idea that we're going to increase pay, we're gonna, around the margins, we're gonna make things better, and we're going to find all these cops. Where's this cop store where we're gonna find them? I mean, that we just don't have the applicants. And that, by the way, is why if we were talking to people in education, in public schools, they're talking about the same stuff. They're talking about the same stuff in the trades. We're seeing a societal shift here. And I think, and Dr. Johnson agrees with me, or I agree with Dr. Johnson, I don't know who first started the conversation, we've had a bunch of them, that we've got a societal shortage of qualified, mentally and physically squared away folks to do much of anything you can think of. But what's the tip of the spear? Where are we really going to first see it? It's going to be in places like law enforcement. That's when you're first going to say, wait, there's something here, because it's frustrating when people talk about having to wait a longer time to get a server to come over at dinner, right? We hear about that all the time. We know that there's all these jobs that are going wanting, but when a 911 call leads to a 10, 20, 30, 40-minute wait time, that's something that really gets everybody's attention. And, I pour on sort of this, this negative, gloomy view. I think there's an obligation, in my humble opinion, for leaders in law enforcement to think beyond the end of their career, to think beyond the next 2 years, and to start having conversations about, civilianizing positions that right now we have someone sworn doing. We need to put it on the table and talk about it. Getting used to a permanent turnover model, like what we have in the military, looking at something where we need to, in many cases, lobby our state legislatures to take a new look at how we do pensions in this country, to reflect the realities that we're seeing on the ground of men and women leaving the profession. Because if they leave for another agency, that's one thing. But if they leave after 6, 7 years because they're burnt out, and Kevin Gilmartin's book, they read it, they underlined it, and they are paying attention, and they're saying, yeah, 6, 7 years, I'm burnt out, I'm hypervigilant. I was talking to my fiance about that, and my cousin has a brewery that's booming, and I can work days and be there for my kids' volleyball games. How do we compete with that? We need to start talking about putting these things on the table now, instead of doing what is human nature, which is we wait for it to get crisis level, and then we say, well, now we'll talk about civilianization. Well, it's a crisis. Now we'll talk about, different ways of approaching this. And those things are going to be uncomfortable. But I think the earlier we start talking about them, I'm not advocating, and Dr. Johnson isn't advocating, that we take a 28-year veteran who's in an administrative position and say, you're working nights on patrol. That's not what we're advocating. What we're saying is if we start talking about what positions can and should be civilianized in the coming years, we can avoid that type of a crisis. And the solutions that I'm seeing: mandatory overtime, asking men and women to work, telling them to work 30 days in a row, 12-hour shifts. This is a reality in a lot of departments, and it is doing nothing but speeding up the exodus from those agencies. So what we're doing is actually more harm than good in so many departments. What we should be talking about is things like, what if someone were to leave and they had extended leave? I have to tell you this one. I was speaking to a young female trooper who was tasked with being the point person for their 30 by 30 initiative, to have 30% female recruits by the year 2030. And something that came up very quickly, I asked her, I said, and I don't know, not every department's the same, but I asked her, and I believe she said that she had been on for 5 years or so. So if my math's correct, she's still in her 20s. And I said, well, do you find as you're looking at this, trooper, do you find that you lose disproportionately a lot of female troopers when they start families? About the 8-year mark, 10-year mark? And she said, yeah, her eyes got real big. She goes, that's a real problem. I said, gotcha. I said, well, look, I've been around, a little while, and I've seen my wife and people that I know, and this is a very personal decision when women sit down with their better half, right, and they try to figure out what they're going to do. But we're seeing a pattern where we've got qualified young women that are coming into the profession, and at 8 years, 10 years, they're leaving because of childcare, because they want to spend time with their children. And then, unlike accountants, unlike lawyers, unlike so many other professions, they don't have an open door to come back in 5, 6 years and to go back into the profession. And we don't even think that way. And it really led to about probably an hour of me talking to this trooper about why that would be something that makes all the sense in the world, and why we need to start thinking that way. But see, none of that is the way we used to do things, right? None of that is that view of you come in, you put in your 30 years, and then you retire. Extended leave or working part-time officer positions. And I'm not saying any of these are magic bullets, but I believe firmly we've got to put all this on the table and start asking ourselves, well, what we're doing isn't working. So what else can we do on the personnel front? And that's not even speaking to technology and clearly communicating with our communities and finding out what are your priorities. And it's a very sad thing to say that things like school resource officers. I believe in SROs very much. I really believe in the good work that school resource officers do. They're great recruiters. It's great community policing. But how sadly ironic that laundry list of things that we heard about really starting in the summer of 2020. We don't want the cops in our schools. We don't want you responding to broken windows calls. We don't want you doing quality of life. We don't want you making traffic stops. Well, that's where we're at. And a lot of agencies are saying sounds good because we don't have the
we don't have the people to do it anyway.
We don't have the people to do it. And that doesn't mean that it's an objectively good thing, but we're seeing agencies across the country saying, here's the calls for service that we can't answer anymore. And, you know, I'm not going to say that Asheville, North Carolina, I know that one because I was married there and my grandparents lived there. So it caught my eye when I saw that there's a lot of calls they're no longer going to be responding to. I'm not saying that's a good thing. What I'm saying is if they're being honest and if the chief there in Asheville is being transparent, I think it's better to tell citizens and to tell business owners what you can expect rather than we just sort of slowly stop responding to those calls for service. All that has to be on the table.
Yeah, because then you have a problem of unfulfilled expectations, and you know we've trained society to believe that if you pick up the phone and call, then the police will be there, right? And if you think about in terms of allocation studies and patrol allocation, generally the way staffing is done and historically has been done in organizations, administrators have been, and a lot of this is because the focus comes from community expectations, but patrol, the response time is generally the number one priority for an emergency call. If you have, we'll just call it a part one type of crime where, there's a significant risk of injury or death, whether it's because of a crime or because of a medical emergency, a car accident, you want somebody there. And I think at the time I was looking at this, I think the average nationwide was anywhere from 3 to 7 minutes was the average response time for a 911 call. So if you know that, and now you have to look at the geography of where you are, if you have an expectation that you need to be there within 3 to 7 minutes, and if your call volume is X number of thousands of calls per hour, per day, per week, whatever, now we can again do the math. We can start to figure out, okay, here's the number of people that we need in order to meet the expectations. And internally, one of the big arguments for patrol allocation has always been workload distribution. So now we have an average response time of 3 to 7 minutes, but we don't want any one officer handling a disproportionate amount of the work. We want to equally distribute the workload. So that comes into the equation. And there's maybe you've seen that formula. They teach it at Staff and Command at Northwestern and other places, but it's a very complex algorithm that you put all these factors in, and it spits out at the end. It spits out basically on your expectation for what your response time is and your workload distribution. Here's the number of staff that you should have, and it's a lot better than the old way of, well, there are 900,000 police officers in America spread across 18,000 different police departments. So on average, per every 1,000 residents, you should have 2.5 police officers. And sadly, there are still agencies out there today that use that formula for going to city council and saying, hey, we need more people because our city, we have 100,000 people in our city. That means that we need 250 police officers, even though that might be 100,000 city where, there's no crime or very low crime, very affluent community. Whereas, across the river or across, a county line, you could have 10,000 citizens that could need 500 officers based on the activity that's going. So, it's just really a long way of saying internally, I don't know that we've done a good job across the board. I think there's pockets of people that have done it very successfully, but across the board of recognizing, okay, well, what truly is the expectation from our community? With the staffing levels that we have, how do we effectively communicate back to our community what they can expect from us? And is particularly in the last few years as we've seen these numbers decline, and you mentioned it in your report. Maybe there are technological solutions that are now in place that didn't exist 10, 20 years ago that can fill the gaps for some of these things where in the past we've had people do these jobs. Well, maybe now there is a technology that can fill it.
You said something that really sparked something on my end of things. When you talk about community expectations, and that's something that you may know we've written about, we've talked about. I think especially in the summer of 2020, and even today, you've got cops that, honest to God, don't know what people want them to do. They
Right.
genuinely will tell you, "I don't know. Here's the scenario. We've got somebody who's high, who's drunk, who's mentally disturbed, who's all three, and he won't leave, and he's ruining date night for all these people. And here's this restaurant. They're just trying to get their legs back after all the restrictions that we've been through. What do you want us to do?" And the cops are saying, "We genuinely don't know, because we know that if we show up, well, what if he comes at us? What if he attacks us? Well, that could go sideways for us. Should we even go to this? What about those social workers we heard about? Because some people were suggesting that I guess we got hundreds of thousands of social workers in a bunker somewhere we didn't know about that are excited about going to these calls for service with a clipboard and a whistle.
Yeah.
It turns out those social workers don't want to go. We don't have enough social workers for social work, the positions that we already have. So that's a non-starter. But
Yes.
something that does come to my mind when you talk about it, the diversity of opinion across our country on what the police should be doing is really staggering.
And you know who they're not asking? Very few people are asking the police about what you think you should do.
Yeah. Oh, well, and
let us tell you what you should be doing.
Yeah, or the practicality of it, or a police expert, someone with experience like you, to say, "I can understand why you want that, but here's why that doesn't make sense." What I think, though, is there is at least a possibility that some of this will be self-sorting, and my heart goes out to the people that don't have a vote, to kids that live in these communities of suffering. I mean, every bit as well as I do, that zip codes across the country, it wasn't that we saw brand new zip codes hit with these homicide numbers. It was the places that were already bad got worse.
Yes.
We saw that in the cities that I've lived in my life: Grand Rapids, Indianapolis, Chicago, Durham, where I live now. It's not a mystery. It's the places that were already bad got a whole lot worse. And so I want that as a caveat, because that's where I have a real problem, is the people that don't have a say, the boys and girls that are born into these cycles of poverty and hopelessness. But with that said, when we look at where are cops leaving, where are we seeing the worst understaffing? As a general matter, we're seeing it in places where, in my estimation, mayors, city managers, and city council have completely scapegoated the police, have tarnished the reputations of a whole department of men and women, generations of law enforcement. They put unreasonable expectations on cops, and that's being borne out by cops leaving those agencies and their sons and daughters going to other departments and not going to those agencies. I was having a beer with a friend of mine in a city that I won't name, that I think sadly falls into that category, where there's elections and they are voting city council members and a mayor and a DA, and you listen to them and you say, wow, okay, well, that's why you have the police situation that you have. Yeah. We're having a beer there, and my friend asked me about a recent use of force and asking me what I think about policing, and he's being very polite and all that. And I said, well, here's the reality. In a city like this one, not every city in the country, but in a city like this one, see, right now, if someone high, drunk, mentally ill were to walk into this little brew pub, real charming, right? All this neighborhood spot, and started making a scene, people would say, call the police. We need to get used to a reality in this city of the police aren't coming. This is not a police matter, and we're going to have to figure it out. I said, that's the reality. I said, I don't want to debate you. We don't have to get into an unpleasant back and forth. We don't see each other that much, but I'm just letting you know that in this city and cities across the country, the trajectory that I see is the cops aren't coming. The cops aren't coming to this. Now, sometimes it's formal. They've made an announcement, and other places you just hear stories. I know I hear stories talking to people across the country of, we had to wait 2 hours before the police came. A friend of mine works at a location in a big city where the security guards had to hold down two men who were in a physical fight for the better part of 2 hours before the police showed up. And there was conversation about, do we just let them go? There's going to be cities where we have to start having those conversations. But where I guess I'm trying to go with all that is there are cities where you ask people, what do you want from the police? And they tell you, we want less this, we want less this, we want less this. Well, interestingly enough, the same places where they want the cops to do less than ever is where people don't want to be the police. So again, my big caveat to sandwich that is there's people that live in that community. There's people that don't agree with maybe the majority view. There's children that live in those communities. And that's something that we're all going to have to come to terms with. But we are seeing depolicing, and we're seeing it particularly in places where if our goal is we want the police to do less of 20 things, but we're not telling the police what we actually want them to do. And maybe that's to your point, Chief, is, okay, so we don't want you to have racial disparities in this, and we don't want you to have racial disparities in that, and we don't want you pulling over for this, and we don't want you using force for that. Okay, well, what do you want us to, what would you have us do in this situation?
Yes.
This student is keeping everyone else from learning. This kid comes in every day and is keeping the teacher from doing their job. We're all ears. What would you like us to do? And the BS answer you're likely to get. Well, we want you to make it a safe learning environment without having to use force or without, well, that's not on the menu because we can either remove the student, we can help you. Otherwise, why are you calling us in the first place? So, there's a lot in there, but I think that's a piece of it is I think that policing for a long time, for my lifetime, I think that to your point, there's best practices, but that's not the same as every agency operating the same. I think there were things we agreed on in law enforcement and in society. And I think that we agreed that if folks are having dinner and somebody is outside exposing themselves, that's something that the cops should come and move them along. Now, I don't know. I mean, I don't mean to be flippant about it, but when you look at some cities and some city councils, I don't know what the answer is. You want that? Well, we don't want that person arrested. And this is not even to speak of the DAs. I mean, really, if we're talking about things that are being decriminalized anyway, if we're talking about officers putting themselves in situations where they're having to utilize force, they could hurt someone, they could be hurt, and the DA doesn't want to prosecute it. That's another piece of this puzzle is there's some counties in this country where we can talk all day long about there's not enough cops in Philadelphia. But Chief, you tell me, put another 1,000 cops out there. If we're not prosecuting crimes, if everyone's getting out 2 hours later, what are we doing? I mean, do we really think that's going to lead to a significant decrease in violent crime? I don't know.
Well, and we've seen that. I mean, we've watched what happens when you have a partnership between your district attorney's office and your police department in New York City under Bill Bratton and what he did with Comstat and broken windows. I mean, there is a data-driven, proven approach about how you can reduce crime, but yet somehow it's history repeats itself because now we flip the apple cart over and we start blaming the police for the problems and not the interactions. But the point I was going to make earlier when I got sidetracked was I was driving through my church parking lot, and the only time in my life where I've had a crash that was my own fault. I got hit several times as a police officer. I got crashed into, but it was my own fault. Just cut a corner a little bit too sharp in our brand new family minivan. And I was, I have USA insurance. I broke out my phone, pulled up the USA app, took a couple pictures, exchanged information. Within 15 minutes, I basically did a crash report, a little basic crash investigation, and submitted it to USAA. And within 24 hours, I had a response. Everything was resolved. So, maybe a little shout out to USAA. But the point of that is like that for me, that was kind of like I had this little epiphany. I was like, as a police department, we respond to crashes on private property. And oftentimes, and my wife works in the insurance industry, and she started out in claims. And if you want to start talking about a discussion of, well, what happens in parking lot crashes, right? You're an attorney, maybe you work some of these cases. Who's at fault? I mean, it's almost always going to be a 50-50 equation, right? Even if you can almost prove that you were not at fault. It's still in a parking lot. And so it really made me start thinking. I was like, well, man, there's a lot of things that we do in policing that you don't necessarily have to have an officer present to be able to capture data and capture information that we might want and that would be useful down the road. And maybe there are ways that we can automate this to make the job easier for the officer, but also, if you're in one of these communities where you make that call, that's not a 911 call, and they're going to tell you, well, yeah, we'll come, but it's, get in line. It might be 3 hours or 4 hours. Well, what happens when people don't understand the expectation in those communities is, well, they get on the phone and they start calling, well, I want to talk to your supervisor. That is not going to acceptable to, I'm not waiting an hour for you to get here. I pay my taxes. And it leads to complaint. It leads to, issues where the community starts to get upset about some of these service related calls that aren't necessarily crime control related calls. And I won't say that they're not public safety related, because crashes are public safety related.
No.
Look at the data from what's happened. And this is another one that I think is curious. Nice way of putting it. We did a lot of driver education. We did a lot, we dumped a ton of money into enforcement for DUIs, driving under the influence in the late 90s and 2000s. And, and you started to see those numbers really start to drop for traffic fatalities around 2005 through 2009. And they remained flat up until just a couple of years ago. Now, there's a couple of reasons I think that is influenced, but number one, the proliferation of cell phones and distracted drivers, I think, is driving crashes up, but particularly in the post-Ferguson days, and depolicing and police departments asking the question, well, if people just think we're out here writing tickets to raise money and generate revenue, well, then we need to stop doing that. And so we take a few small examples of police departments that are not doing it the right way, that are actually, setting speed traps and doing things to drive revenue up. Where in most police departments, it's just a strategy to try to reduce the number of fatal crashes and crashes overall, because warnings don't work. I mean, statistically, it's one of the few things that we know, where you can actually point to causality, not just correlation. If you write more tickets, the number of crashes go down. It's as simple as that. Well, what happened prior to COVID? The number of traffic stops started to decline, and then COVID just, increased that lack of enforcement. And so, yeah, people are driving. They're driving a hell of a lot faster out on the interstates and on the roads. And it just cracks me up. I actually, there was a New York Times article that talked about this, where they speculated that the reasons crash fatalities were going up is because drivers were releasing pent-up frustration from being quarantined over COVID. Like that, I'm paraphrasing here, but
yeah,
that was the basic premise of the story, was that's why fatalities are up. And it's like, no. No, sorry. Yeah. And it's laughable if anyone's going to believe this. Show me some data to support this argument, some actual real data.
I'll tell you with the crashes and driving under the influence, to take it, I think, and based on what you've said today, Chief, I think we're singing from the same sheet of music here. We put too much on the police, and we've added. It's sort of like your belt. When your officers, when you retired, think about how much they had on their person, how much they had in their car compared to when you went into the profession. And I think that that's sort of symbolic of all the things that we've put on the police, things that are a 911 call that maybe it didn't used to be. And when you talk about things like driving under the influence, I certainly don't want to say I don't want that being enforced. I do. But I also happen to believe that the ethical appeal that we saw in my generation, I was born in 1984, and not only for me personally, but in my social circles, driving under the influence has a serious social stigma. It is not okay. It's not a minor deal. And that's because of every basketball game, football game, baseball game growing up, Mothers Against Drunk Driving, commercials, and pictures of dead kids.
Yeah.
And we have to have an ethical appeal there. And you go back to Peelian principles, which I'm fond of always going back to from 1829. Voluntary compliance is one of the key ideas that we take from Sir Robert Peel. And if we don't have voluntary compliance and we expect the police to somehow solve that for us, I mean, what does it say about so many people that if they know they're not going to get caught, or if they think they're not going to get caught, they'll get drunk, they'll get high, and they'll drive. Now, again, I think that we have a lot of good reason to think a certain percentage of the population is not functioning and they have a ripple effect. And if they weren't committing crimes and wreaking havoc, and if we had only a place to put someone like that, I guess we can brainstorm about that. I think we used to do that. Then they would stop committing crimes and we would see a positive impact. But I do think that we might have to see more of an ethical appeal on hopefully not things as deadly as crashes. But I think when we talk about what we expect as a community from our fellow citizens, we may have to, the citizen part of this is we might have to start talking about, look, we don't have the police, like calling mom or dad to come in and sort this out for us. And if we've got a neighbor dispute, you've got departments across the country that are saying we're not going out to that. And if they do, back to your piece on technology, I could be way off. But I can't help but think of a world in 10 years where drones are deployed to take reports. I mean, if the report is something that does not warrant a forcible arrest, maybe that's a rule of thumb. Does this crime, this offense, this violation, does it warrant a forcible arrest? And if the answer is no, explain to me again why we're sending out a cop to that scene when we're so desperately in need of officers for a violent crime in progress. What if we were to send a drone? It's a bit of a bizarre thought, I guess, but I don't know. I mean, we've come a long way in the last 10 years when it comes to what drones are utilized for. And it's not a future that I relish. It's not something that I think sounds particularly great. But if we don't have enough folks that can meet standards for an officer, do we have people that can meet the standards of working at a keyboard and deploying to 123 Smith Street and taking a report on something that's happened, on a property crime, something of that nature? So that's the technology piece. I think it's sort of an unending laundry list almost of things to at least start talking about. And I can always hear in my mind the cops that I've met, who've got that resting angry face already, and they're crossing their arms, and they're going to tell me all the reasons why stuff I'm talking about, extended leave for somebody that's starting a family, not just young female officers, but young male officers as well. 20 somethings that say, I want to step away from law enforcement. It's been great. Hey, hope I can come back at some time, might do that. And in 5 years, do we have an expedited process to get their certification back, get them back out in the field? I can think of a lot of the pushback on all these, but what we're doing so far isn't working. And what the numbers show us is it's going to get a hell of a lot worse. It is going to get much, much worse. And to your point, Chief, think of all those agencies that are happy to say we're fully staffed. How many agencies are they stealing from? And what happens when those agencies, when their pipelines have dried up? Just the math on it just doesn't work. One of the many reasons I went to law school is because I knew what I wasn't good at. And one of them is math. But I can do the math on this. I can do the math when I see these graphs of we don't have enough people with clean backgrounds, that don't have serious mental health issues, that don't have, people that are functioning at a high level, people that have basic physical fitness. If we don't have enough of those folks, well, then guess what? We're going to have to do something else, particularly if, as you mentioned with your son, we're having to compete with the fire departments. When we have those people that are public safety minded, who are altruistic, the altruistic professions, teachers, firefighters, police, they're all fighting for the same talent, for that same pool. And something's going to have to give here. And I think the agencies that are going to be in a particularly disastrous position are the ones who take away from a conversation like this. All right, we'll just keep doing what we're doing. Or, okay, let's go with the $5,000 bonus. Really? That's the answer? It doesn't seem like it makes sense to me.
No, and I know we're getting long on time here, so I'm going to try to wrap things up here in the next few minutes. But yeah, the teacher analogy I think is interesting. A lot of in the last election cycle, a lot of discussion about the money for education, and people always think that dumping money into a problem is going to fix it. Now, it certainly helps in certain ways, but for the reasons you just pointed out, we're all competing from the same pool, and it's fascinating to me that in some areas you see a big there's there's big pushes for defunding the police. At the same time, we want to invest in teachers and invest in our schools. And go to those areas and sit in a classroom for a day. And this is one of the reasons why I always advocated for people participating in the Citizens Academy, because we have a lot of people that come into that have an opinion about what they think policing is. And the best thing that we can do in a Citizens Academy is not sit there and try to appeal to people's emotional side, but to just put them in a squad car and let them go see for themselves, and then have them sit in front of police instructors that will tell you, well, hey, you got questions about why we arrest somebody and why we don't arrest somebody? Well, here's what the criminal code says. This is what we can and can't do. This is what the Supreme Court says we can and can't do. So at the end, it's a big investment from citizens, but at the end of 8 weeks, 10 weeks, depending on how long your program is, at the end, my favorite 2 days were always the first day and the last day. The first day, we set up the expectations for what they're going to get from the program. The last day, we get the feedback. And to me, there's never been a bad experience from the Citizens Academy, because everybody at the people that participate in it, the police officers that are instructing, the officers that have riders in their cars, everybody learns from each other. At the end of that, you build relationships, you exchange information and ideas, and at the end of it, it's kind of like the Socratic process, right? The object isn't to win. At the end of it, it's to come to a higher level of understanding about what it is that I have a strong opinion about. Teachers, I know a lot of teachers, and some school districts, are on autopilot. They've got very safe communities. They've got dual educated parents. High income, and then the other communities, you've got just the opposite. Kids coming from broken homes. 30-40% of their students, English is a second language. They don't have safety and security in their home every night. They don't know where their next meals are coming from. And you try to tell me that teaching in those two schools is the same thing? No way. Yeah. And by the way, those teachers that are in those schools, they don't feel safe oftentimes. And so the idea that we should put cameras on cops but not put cameras in our classrooms, another interesting discussion.
Yeah.
We'll save that for another day.
But hey, I'll just say, I think that the school board's got a taste of Peelian principles in the last few years.
Oh, yeah.
Because they told parents, sit down, shut up, mind your business. We're the experts, and we'll tell you what's okay. You drop your kid off, you pick your kid up, and you say thank you. And that doesn't seem to go very well. I know here in North Carolina, every Catholic school in the diocese, including my children's, has a waiting list. And people are homeschooling, and they're starting private academies, because they're walking away from it because there's a feeling that they don't respond. That was sort of like, well, welcome to the party, right? I mean, that was sort of, if there's a gap between what people's expectations are and at least a sense that you're not listening, whether it's as the teachers or as the police, you're going to have a real problem there. And when you talk about the teachers, I'll just say this, speaking of Catholic school, how many places in this country the Catholic school teachers make less money and have less in terms of pension than the public school teachers? And yet we have all these talented teachers that go to the Catholic school. How much does that say about intrinsic motivation? How much does that say about people that are in the profession of teaching for the right reason, that leave more money? None of it, they're not getting rich anywhere, I understand, but right. They're leaving more money, they're leaving more union protection in many cases to go work at a Catholic school because of the parents, because of the support, because they can say that Henry needs to do better in Spanish and he's struggling in this area, and they're much more likely to have two parents look back at them and say, you're right, how can we help, as opposed to an angry, exhausted parent saying, you're picking on my kid. How do you put a value on that? And what I am concerned about, bigger picture, and I don't think it bodes well in terms of societal health, but I do think that it seems to be emerging as a reality. You're going to see, for lack of a better phrase, the rich get richer and the poor get poorer. I see the state of policing being wildly different from one city to another. I see places that are going to be fully staffed or near fully staffed, where you have community expectations that are clear, and you're going to see talent going to those places, just like we see talent going to Catholic schools and to other things. And we're going to see the communities that, sadly, as you know, Chief, they need the police the most. But those also happen to be in so many places where the police have been demonized the most. And I think there's young men and women that are being raised on Paw Patrol like I'm raising my kids on Paw Patrol. And I don't know, maybe some of my 4 kids will go into law enforcement. I would support it 100%. And if they did, I think it's not a question of will they go into policing. It's a question of, am I going to be a police officer there, or am I going to be a police officer here? And the answer is going to be the same place that their other peers are going, that have options and have that solid background and have their choice. And that says a lot, I think, on the negative side about sort of a nationwide societal conversation. But I also understand that in challenging times, like the ones I think we have ahead of us, I think the times ahead for us in terms of safety, public safety, crime, I'm not optimistic, Chief. I have no logical reason to be optimistic, but I do think that there are some cities, some towns, some counties that will get top-notch policing from great professionals. But sadly, I'm afraid that a lot of other places are going to continue down this cycle because they're not thinking long-term and they're not having the conversations we're having, frankly.
And for people that are listening that might think that this is a little hyperbole, here are just a few examples. California Sheriff's Department just, what was that, last week or the week before?
Yeah.
Made the public announcement that because they were short-staffed, they weren't going to have deputies out during the day. They're going to have to ask the state police to come in and patrol those areas in case of emergencies. And then they said, we'll try to catch up when our deputies come in at night. We're going to staff them in the times during peak call volume hours. I will say that probably is happening a lot more, but people just aren't saying it. They're not saying it out loud. So at least kudos to them for being able to come out and say publicly, well, this is what the situation is. And then in terms of also privatizing some of these services, we've seen that just a story here just in the last month in the St. Louis area, where there's groups that are, private contractors, kind of like your Blackwaters of law enforcement, that are providing, they're staffing these private security companies with full-time police officers, and they're paying them wages that, for more affluent communities that the municipal budgets can't support. So, hard to tell an officer, hey, no, we're not going to let you work here, or no, you can't go work somewhere where you're going to make $100,000 a year. You have to go work somewhere where you're going to make $50,000 a year. Oh, and by the way, in that place where you're going to get half the pay, you're also going to have low community support, low political support, but the expectation and the demands, the accountability on your performance is going to be very high.
And let's make it even worse, Chief, and talk about the reality that in a lot of those agencies where they have low political support, low community support, there are folks, even as young as myself, I'm 38 years old. So if I had gone into law enforcement right after I graduated college, I'd be at 16 years. You have folks that are house mouse positions. They're house mouse positions. They're not answering calls for service. Right. They're working somewhere else, especially the larger the agency, the more of these spots you tend to have. And so as bad as the problem is, that's what makes the problem even worse, is that you have agencies where if those folks were required to actually go out and answer these calls and make these traffic stops, they would leave. What's keeping them there and what's keeping the staffing there, in sort of sarcastic air quotes, is those types of house mouse positions. Now, I don't want to speak out of turn and say that I have a great estimate on what that is, but I do feel confident that even an outside schmuck attorney like me could look at the organizational chart of a lot of our mid-sized and larger agencies and could very easily find plenty of people. Now, why do you need 5 sworn officers doing this? And the real answer is, well, we used to be able to do that because we used to have gymnasiums filled with qualified applicants, and we could always have people after 15 years of working in high crime areas, we could reward them with some of these admin positions. So if you actually look at that, that's the deployment versus staffing conversation. that makes it even worse, just to your point. So, some of those places, if it weren't for that mismanagement, you would have even less staffing. But it's what you were saying before, Chief, and what I think I said in a different way. A lot of this stuff is happening just behind the scenes. Agencies where people are being unarrested if they have to go to the hospital because they don't have the personnel to sit on the door. And those aren't making headlines, but it's happening.
All the time. It's been happening for a while. I do think that there are solutions that are available, and I do think that there are answers in the short term that can help bridge some of these gaps. And I've talked about this on one of the previous shows, but if you can find partnerships, exploit them. We're fortunate. Where I'm from, we've got a university. Purdue University sits right across the river from Lafayette, and back in the late 2000s, they had a program. It was a DHS program, Department of Homeland Security Center of Excellence, where they were taking STEM universities, so science, technology, math, and they're saying, let's partner with practitioners, the DoD, public safety, and let's try to take the academic world and really put them with practitioners and come up with some ideas and products and technologies that can make the world a safer place, that make the United States a safer place. So and I use this as just one example because I know there are several technologies out there that does this, but one of the technologies that was a spinoff and ultimately as a result, a company called DaVista Technologies, and they have a software platform called Heimdall, and you'll get the name here in a second, but based off the Greek god Heimdall. But it's taking all of your data, it ingests all of your data, and using advanced algorithms and machine learning, it will tell you where your problem areas are, where your calls for service are being generated, it drives a value equation for what the officers that you have assigned, what they're doing with their time each day. You can visualize it on the map. Based on what you're entering into the system, you can it can point to you. Basically, it can tell you what's trending in your data. So you can, when we talk about information, right? We're policing. We've always been in the information business. So in the community policing discussion about this. Why is community policing so beneficial? Well, it's because people tell you what's happening. Nobody knows neighborhoods better than the people that live in them. And if you're a drive-through agency, and I'm going to and from and not listening or not seeing or hearing the people as you go through these neighborhoods, well, then no one's ever going to tell you anything. And I learned that lesson the hard way. I had a good FTO that pointed that out to me at a very young age. The job's a lot harder when people don't tell you what's happening. You're not going to solve homicides when people aren't telling you who's who and what's happening. It doesn't matter how good your technology is. If people aren't giving you good data, good information, you got nowhere to start. But there's also truth in that we collect large sums of data, and when you can aggregate data and put it together in meaningful ways using machine learning algorithms, well, then that, no one person can ever remember the same thing as 250 people, but the machines don't forget. And so I say all of this and just saying there's an example of, well, now if we use the right technology, we can be very prescriptive and precise about how we're going to deploy our resources. Yeah. Maybe part of the, call it trimming the fat, right? Well, maybe an organization that has had 200 officers historically really only needed about 150. They just needed the 150 to have performance metrics where we can identify who's performing, who's not performing, but then also put them in the places where we need them. Put them, as Jack Maple used to say, put the cops on the dots, and I like to say, well, put the right cops on the right dots, and you can even be more productive. So there's one example of where technology can kind of fill in the gap. And then, one of the other things, like when it comes to body cameras, dash cams, nobody wanted those more than police officers themselves. There's a lot of stuff that comes from those, but in short, some of the changes that we made as an agency were just, okay, well, there's a lot of things that we do that we write reports on, that we document, been there, saw that, wrote it down, but that we're never going to take follow-up action on. So there are opportunities now where, and different companies are doing this. I know I just personally have my most experiences with Axon, and I think that they have a good idea about what the future looks like in terms of, well, how do we simplify processes? So I do think the future looks good, and I know they're not the only company that's doing that, but the future looks good for technology, again, eliminating human tasks, automating processes. So but on the back end of that, it does kind of create maybe an issue where the officers that we are hiring are going to have to be a little bit more technology oriented than in the past. So I only say these couple of things just say because, and if people haven't read the report, and I'll ask you here to tell us where you can find it. But the name of the report is called Weathering the Storm in Police Staffing. I think if you just do a Google search on that, you'll find it. Because you raise so many pertinent issues, and we've talked about, and we've only kind of scratched the surface in our conversation here. But I knew we were going to go long, and we have. So I want to refer people to come back and read this report, and then think about, hopefully, if you get nothing else from this podcast today, most of the things that we're talking about, I know police leaders have been talking about these things. They've been searching for solutions, and they have come up with good solutions. But what I'm hoping that we can do here in the next few years and moving forward is share what we're learning, communicating effectively about what we're learning, not being apologists in the policing profession for what we do and why we do it. Give your public the credit because they will understand. Tell them, speak the hard truths, and but most importantly, within your own organizations, right? What kind of where we started the conversation is with accountability. We have to have a high level of individual accountability and organizational accountability. So when we go out and have these difficult conversations with our communities, they'll understand that we're on a precipice here in society, and things really could go really bad if we don't get a course correction here soon. And with that, I'll give you the final word here, sir.
Well, Chief, because you were in the hot seat as the chief of police. I saw my father in that position as police chief, and where I see liability issues, I tend to see leadership failures. I'm not going to say one necessarily means that we have the other, but typically when you look at Minneapolis, Cleveland, we look at these cities writing these massive checks, we can find leadership failures. And so as I look at leadership in law enforcement across the country, I would advocate, and I advocate as best I can in what I do, that leaders do the moral thing, do the ethical thing, and have these tough conversations now. Because make no mistake, there's every self-interested motivation to not have these conversations. There is every self-interested motivation for a chief, for a deputy chief, for someone that's higher up to say, I'm a year, 2 years from retirement. Why do I want to take on this headache? And this is going to generate a lot of questions. But if we don't start having these conversations, as I said earlier, I think we're going to have a pivot that's going to be more painful than it has to be. Where I think if we have courageous leaders, and I know that they're out there, courageous leaders in law enforcement saying what we're doing isn't working. We need to look short term. We need to look at how we help the folks that aren't going to be cops for another 10 years. What are we doing on that side? Let's get back to police explorers. Let's get back to police athletic leagues. Let's talk about ways that we can partner with the community instead of just complaining about, well, the 21-year-olds stink now. And they've got all these issues and they're out of shape and they've got mental health issues and they've got background red flags we get through. Well, then maybe the police do need to be partnering, as you said, with church organizations, with community service organizations, and start creating pipelines of great citizens. And hopefully a good chunk of those great citizens will be our police officers, and some of them will be firefighters, and some of them will be teachers. But I think, as you said, there's a lot of room for optimism. But I think that the optimism has a prerequisite, which is you first have to acknowledge that these are some challenges. These are challenges that we haven't seen in my lifetime, I would argue, in quite the same way. And that if we are going to get through this, not just weathering a temporary storm, not just waiting till next year, but recognizing that we're going to have to see changes for a lot of agencies in things that they've done a certain way for a very long time. The earlier we start putting things on the table and having the conversations, the better off agencies are going to be. And I think that the departments that are going to do the best are the ones that have men and women who are willing to give themselves a lot of heartburn, a lot of stress and strain, get a lot of looks of people not understanding where in the hell are you coming from? What are you talking about? Civilianizing, and you're talking about drones, and you're talking about doing the, you're talking about extended leave, and you're talking, where is this coming from? Well, no, where it's coming from is I've got another year or 2 years in this profession, and I want to do everything I can to put my people in the best position to succeed. But it's a thankless task. But the good news is, and talk about optimism, Chief, yours is a thankless business. So if you were looking for a career to go into where people constantly tell you, great job, Patrick, you're really special, and a kiss on the forehead.
Where's my trophy?
Yeah, where's your trophy? You don't go into law enforcement. So that's an optimistic note to end on, is I know that there's men and women. I was raised by them. I know them. I'm friends with them. People that knew they were getting into a thankless, selfless task. That's what makes it so noble. And we just need to ask a lot of our leaders to turn that up a couple of notches, and towards the end of their careers, really taking on these tough issues. I mean, who doesn't want to continue standard operating procedures? I mean, it's not excusable, but it's certainly understandable. I don't want to act as if I can't understand why police chiefs across the country would want to end every story with, well, we're talking to the union, we're going to get a retention bonus, and everything's going to be fine. Well, it's not going to be fine. I mean, it's not going to be fine if we don't start really talking about reconfiguring a lot more things. But I think we do have those leaders, and I hope that those leaders step up and meet the challenge across the country to have tough, complicated conversations about, hey, if we're really gonna get through this, and we have to, it's gonna be a task of necessity. We're going to have to change the way that we've done things. It can't just be about, we're going to weather, we'll keep doing what we're doing. The economy can't be this good forever. Someone's going to have to come back to work. The data that we have at dolanconsultinggroup.com, if you go to the articles tab, it's one of our more recent ones. When you look at the weathering the storm data, this is stuff that's beyond your control. It's society-wide. And the earlier that law enforcement leaders address the problem and start looking for proactive solutions, the better off they're going to be, and the better off, fundamentally the community is going to be. And that's all of us. And you can speak to that, Chief, as a retired officer. Now you're a citizen, and you know what it's like to be on that side of it too. So anyway, that's my thought on it. I think some short-term difficulty, some short-term tough conversations for a longer-term optimism to maintain standards and to protect the nobility of this profession.
Well, thank you very much. And you answered my next question before I was had a chance to ask it, but where can people find you? And I would encourage people to go to your website, seek out your training. You don't have to go on site anymore. They've got great remote training, and it's affordable. And I know we talk a lot about training and training budgets and funding. If you've got council members or others in your community that maybe need to hear this conversation, direct them to this podcast, and hopefully that will help get people that are in a position of influence to begin to understand that this is a problem, but it is solvable, and there are things that we can do. And so I really appreciate your time. And with that, I will say thanks for listening. Thanks for spending your valuable time with us. And my final comment might be then, rather than weathering the storm in police staffing, maybe it should be turn into the storm, because it's coming. If you just got the sails up, you're going wherever the wind takes you, and you're probably going to get capsized if you're not being proactive. So turn into it, folks. Turn into it. Have a great day, and we're out. Going to axoncoaching.com. Check us out. and contact us today. Until our next episode, I'm 1042.